Cordia. On behalf of the Peter Daly Society, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for travelling down. When we set up the Peter Daly Society, we set it up with two basic aims. The first, obviously, was to commemorate Peter's political life, which included as an IRA volunteer in the War of Independence and the Civil War, a member of the Republican Congress, a member of the Communist Party, and finally, as a member of the heroic international brigades who travelled to Spain to fight fascism. As part of that aim, within the next 12 months, we will travel to Spain with the purpose of erecting a plaque to Peter on Portobello Hill near Quinto, where he was fatally injured. Our second aim for the Society, which is just as important to us, was to promote Peter's socialist Republican politics. We believe there are disillusioned Republicans and Socialists in every county trying to make sense of the non-stop onslaught on working class families from right-wing parties and the forces of capitalism. As James Connolly said, from socialism alone can the salvation of Ireland come. To encourage more socialist Republican discussion in the South East, on Saturday the 19th of October in the Ashdown Park Hotel in Gordy, we, the Peter Daly Society, have invited comrades of the Padre O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum down for a political discussion and for the launch of their collection of seminar papers. This leads me on nicely to our guest speaker. Tom has worked tirelessly all his political life for the betterment of the working class and the advancement of socialist politics, both through the Connolly Association in Britain and also the Communist Party of Ireland. He is also heavily involved in both the Peter Daly Society and the Padre O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. Can you please give a warm welcome to our comrade, Tom Redmond.
Comrades and friends, it is an honour to be invited to speak here at this hallowed place. I'm actually deputising for Eugene McCartan, who is due to be the main speaker here, but unfortunately only this morning he got sick, so he asked me to speak in this place. So it'll be a bit of an impromptu speech without the eloquence of Steve McCann. It's a great occasion, and it's great to see in all parts of Ireland memorials and tributes being paid to the men who went and fought. Many of them died in the Spanish earth. Because we do this not out of nostalgia, we do it because we want to keep alive and keep relevant what they fought and what they died for. And Steve had said, traced very briefly, and the history of Peter Daly is on our website, of where he came from, who he was, and what made him the sort of man that he was, to risk and give his life. And of course he was an IRA volunteer, both during the War of Independence, in the Civil War, was imprisoned, was on hunger strike, had to emigrate to Britain to find employment like many of our generation, and also of today's generation. And he took part in the Republican Congress, and he was the epitome of socialism and republicanism. In fact, it's the internationalism. He ended up being killed as command battalion of the British battalion. Such was the internationalism of Irish republicanism, which dates back, as we know, as far as Wolfe Tone. We are commemorating and perhaps over-commemorating and perhaps getting a bit saturated with the 100th anniversary of 1913. And as you saw last Saturday, it even became a state occasion, where those plebs like myself were refused entry to part of O'Connell Street because it was reserved for the VIPs. And it's a bit ironic of those who understood what 1913 was all about to have to give way to the likes of Brother Gilmore and people of his ilk. It's a bit like when Labour was told to wait in 1918. In fact, Labour was never told to wait. It's a fallacy that Dev and Sinn Féin had. Labour voluntarily waited and took no part. It decided that it was not going as an independent party in the 1918 elections and left it to Sinn Féin, which was composed of different class elements. But from the 1913, beaten and defeated, grew, the important thing, grew the citizen army. And it's to the citizen army that we should look for the inspiration, because it gave us 1916 and it gave us the proclamation, which later gave us the first, the democratic programme of unclaimed law. But what that represented, and you notice that a lot of the 1913 commemoration is attempted to personalise Murphy versus Larkin, and almost forgotten, you know, are the men and women of the strike, and of the, as I say, the beginning of the citizen army. Because what that grew from was, as I say, the 1916 rebellion. But the important thing about all that period was it was the first time that the Irish working class entered and affected the national scene, the national politics, the national life as an independent force. Because as we are beginning to know that arising, the War of Independence had two aspects. The struggle of the volunteers and the armed contribution, but it also had the social presence of the general strike against conscription, of, as you know, the land wars that took place, the Soviets that were erected, the taking over of the Creamies. This was a working class in rebellion, complementing the national struggle, and that must never be forgotten, because that was the essence that created the Peter Dalys. That was the essence. You remember the story, and perhaps we repeated it here before, of Mellows and Pat O'Donnell in Mountjoy at the height of the Civil War, and Mellows, they're looking out the window and they see some dockers going home from work, tired, dirty, and they mused to themselves, what did the Republic mean to them? What did the working class identify with? And unfortunately, not enough. And it caused O'Donnell to become a social agitator. And of course, we had Mellows write his notes from Mountjoy before they murdered him. And the conclusion was that you cannot separate the national struggle, the struggle for independence, from the social struggle of emancipation. In other words, they were bringing, as Stevie has quoted, they were bringing Connolly along to another generation. And Peter Daly precisely did that with the men and women of the 30s who created the Republican Congress and fused again those huge, great traditions of the social and the political movements of the working class. Just to deal with what today would mean to this generation, as I said, that the mantle had been passed right the way through of the merging and the fusions of these two traditions. And I'm sure that Daly would look upon us and wonder why the whole future of this country, its people, its youth, has been burdened and jettisoned and sold away to pay foreign bankers, to pay speculators. And that burden has been put back on the same working class who were borne the brunt of every degradation and unrest that's been posed by capitalism in this country. I want to speak on, and Stevie mentioned it, the Peter Daly Society has been unique, because within that milieu of socialist republicanism, there are, even here today, there are different organisations with different traditions and different viewpoints, different policies. And there's often a tendency to elevate these, to make them the things that you discuss, the things that you row about, the things that you gossip about in the pubs. Have you heard the ladies? What the Peter Daly Society had done by drawing on the example of the man himself was to build a unity, a unity in diversity. That diversity is not its weakness, it's its strength, because it brings people from different groups together. And that must be cherished. That must be cherished. Because the future in this country lies not with any coalition of capitalist parties, it lies with a coalition of the broad left, of the socialists and the Republican. And that must be valued, that must be worked for, that must be cherished. And we must ensure, you know, that is valued. And this is what the uniqueness of the Peter Daly thing. We don't have 5 commemorations at the same day from different, we don't have 5 or 6 groups from Bodenstown. And, you know, we value that unity. And that, as I say, doesn't come easy, does it? Because we all have our own sense of importance and correctness and rightness and dogmatism, that we should ensure that there is that unity. And the Paddy O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum that Stevie has just mentioned is an attempt to extend what has been tried and achieved here on a nationwide, on the 32 counties, where groups can come together with a principled position of working together, of discussing what socialism means in the 21st century, what relevance Republican has and should have, and to build that unity from the ground up, from ordinary rank and file people debating these ideas, drawing strength in that debate, drawing strength from the unity, because from that debate and that re-education of ourselves comes unity in action. And that unity in action is the thing we hope that, you know, is going to bring the tradition I've spoken of through the generations to new heights, and will meet the challenges that capitalism and imperialism is enforcing on this country. So again, thank you very much for the honour of speaking there.
Tom. We have a further speaker. We're absolutely delighted he's travelled down here unexpectedly. He's the Irish Secretary of the International Brigade's Memorial Trust. So I was wondering, could you all invite Manus Eireann up here to speak?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm delighted to be speaking here and to bring here the banner of the Connolly Column, because that banner was a banner designed by Ger O'Leary for the Irish veterans of the International Brigade. It was the banner that was carried when the first memorial was put up on Achill Island in 1984 to Tommy Patton, who was the very first Irishman who fell in the Spanish anti-fascist war. And it was the banner behind which marched veterans like my father, Michael O'Riordan, Peter O'Connor, Joe Monks, Maurice Levitas, Bob Doyle, all veterans, Irish veterans of both the British and American battalions of the International Brigade. The Connolly Column veterans themselves then were in turn members of the International Brigade Association, which combined veterans living in both Britain and Ireland, irrespective of what battalion they may have fought in. And out when the final veterans of the International Brigade Association were diminished in numbers, they joined forces with the Friends of the International Brigades, which was mainly family. The IBA was solely a veterans organisation, but there were Friends of the International Brigades in Britain and Ireland that were mainly family and friends. And they came together under the leadership of Jack Jones, the great Union leader, Jack James Larkin Jones, as he was christened by his father when he was born in 1913, and they set up the International Brigade Memorial Trust, and I'm its Irish Secretary. Now, Tom mentioned some disagreeable aspects of the centenary of commemorations in relation to how the 1913 dispute and lockout was being dealt with. Believe me, there's worse to come. Wait till next year. And we have the celebration of an imperialist war. And this is where we have to make a distinction between the British imperialist tradition and the British anti-imperialist tradition. because it was no accident that somebody like Peter Daly, a veteran of the Irish War of Independence, was a commander of a British battalion, as indeed was another Irishman, Paddy O'Dare, and was a Manchester Irishman who was the last commander, Sam Wilde. Because they represented the best traditions of anti-imperialism in Britain. There were many ex-servicemen from the First World War in the International Brigades, but there were no Poppy Day celebrations in the International Brigades. What you did have celebrated in the American Battalion in 1937, organised by people like Peter O'Connor, was in fact the James Connolly Commemoration in May of 1937. What you did have celebrated in the British Battalion, organised by British battalion volunteers like my father, was Bodenstown Sunday on the very eve of the Battle of the Ebro, where all of the British Battalion combined in honouring Wolfe Tone and the best traditions he represented. So that when a decision was taken to try and retake the fascist land on the other side of the river Ebro, and various and flags were carried across, each company recognising the national question in Spain itself also carried the flag of Catalonia. And one of the companies, Sam Wilde, the Manchester Irish commander of the British Battalion, singled out my father to carry that flag, because he says the Irish national question and the Catalan national questions, you can understand each other, and it's appropriate that an Irishman carries that particular flag. Now, this month will represent the 75th anniversary of the final stand of the British Battalion, in which two Irishmen were killed, Jack Nalty and Lee McGregor. And the story of Lee McGregor is particularly interesting and moving, because I knew his mother, who lived into the 1980s as an activist, a communist activist, and had always been active in the Inchicore area. But she was twice bereaved. Her husband had been killed in the First World War, and her son had been killed in the Spanish Anti-Fascist War. The first was a wasted life, part of the cannon fodder for British imperialism in that particular war. Indeed, in my own family, I have no deaths to record in the War of Independence. But my maternal grandfather's first cousin was killed in the First World War, and of course he was mourned, and you always mourn the dead. But he was primarily mourned because he fell in the wrong uniform. And I think when the drums of war are beating again, we have to bear that in mind. We have to recoil in disgust when we hear the British Prime Minister saying Britain cleared Europe of fascism. And he made that statement in the city of Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, but the city of Leningrad that withstood a horrific siege. And if anybody has visited it, you can visit a mass graveyard where there are 600,000 people buried who died during that siege. It was in fact the Red Army that cleared Europe of fascism. Britain belatedly organised a second front. Worse still, those who had seen the dangers of fascism and warned about it, as Bob Doyle often said, bombs that are now falling on Guernica and Madrid and Barcelona will ultimately fall on London and Coventry and indeed Belfast. It was necessary then to take a stand against fascism. The British government colluded with Franco's revolt against the democratic elected government. And when Britain and America were in a Second World War, they discriminated in their armies against those who had actually fought in Spain. They actually described people like Peter Daly as premature anti-fascists. So when we see the dangers of imperialist war occurring again, when we see a culture developing next year around the celebration and commemoration of that first great imperialist war, we need to stand back and say, hold on, there are different traditions in fighting, because Peter Daly was a warrior. He was not a warmonger. Peter Daly was a warrior who fought in two very definite wars, one a war of independence and one a defence of democracy against the fascist revolt. So let us celebrate the premature anti-fascists like Peter Daly, who recognised dangers and fought against it, and let us contrast that with the horrific spectacle we're going to see next year of a celebration of imperialist war at its worst. Thank you.
We're now going to have the line in the reeds. Can I just ask anyone that's laying a reed, can they just come to the front and pass the reed to Chris? Our first read is from the Peter Daly Society. I'll invite John Kenny up to lay it, please. I'd ask Liam on behalf of Anti-Fascist Action. Simon Redmond on behalf of the Communist Party of Ireland. Roger Kiernan on behalf of Sinn Féin. Owen Doyle on behalf of the local Peter Daly Common. And Councillor John Dwyer on behalf of Erdigi. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for travelling. I know it's been long distance for some people. I'd like to invite you all inside for a few sociable drinks. You're more than welcome to join us. And once again, thanks very much. I really appreciate you all coming down. Thank you.